The year is 864 CE. The land of England is divided between four Anglo-Saxon kingdoms: Wessex to the south, East Anglia to the east, Northumbria to the north, and Mercia controlling what is now the Midlands and most of central England. However, in only a year's time, everything would change. In 865 CE, a Viking force would land in East Anglia. Unlike the previous raids, this was a large army. It was in fact the well-recorded Great Heathen Army that was said to be led by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, the great Viking king. After landing in East Anglia and demanding tribute from the local King Edward for peace, the army heads north to Northumbria, conquering the borough of York and the surrounding territory. Following this, the army went on to conquer half of Mercia, and finally, all of East Anglia despite the previous tribute. By 878 CE, the main invasion was finished and roughly half of England was in the Danelaw. Over the following years, Alfred the Great and his successors would retake control of the lands that made up the Danelaw. However, even with the expulsion of the Norse lords, the settlers continued to affect the lands they occupied and had integrated themselves into, by impacting the culture and language of the region. A great deal of the Danelaw was in the Midlands, or more specifically, the East Midlands. This territory is in fact known as the Five Boroughs, made up of Derby, Leicester, Lincoln, Nottingham and Stamford, which were the host of Viking power in the region. For a series of reasons, the Viking conquest, occupation and settlement of the East Midlands was unique.
They seem not to have taken over Anglo-Saxon farms, but found places for themselves to settle instead. So when they settled, the dominant language in an area was Old Norse.
The Viking settlers didn't enter the Midlands as aggressive conquerors. Upon entering the area, instead of evicting and replacing the Anglo-Saxon farmers, the Vikings instead started to farm the unoccupied lands. This led to the mixture of Norse and Anglo-Saxon names in the East Midlands. The Anglo-Saxon Scandinavian culture also affected the area legally.
When the Vikings arrived in the East Midlands, there were no real institutions in place to resist them. They founded the main towns, they set up the basis for large-scale trading, and they caused their opponents to centralise power and become more powerful as well in the East Midlands.
The land was divided by the Norse system of governance, and Nottingham, for example, continued to be affected and governed by these rules for many years after being reconquered by the Anglo-Saxons. The peaceful integration of the settlers led to casual relations between the Anglo-Saxon peasants and Viking settlers.
The Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons seem to have lived side by side without too much conflict.
This union allowed for a more unique Anglo-Scandinavian culture to be created. This culture, while Anglo-Saxon, was heavily affected by the Norse language and system of governance.
In some areas, Old Norse was the dominant language because there were more Vikings settled there. In other areas, Old English was the dominant language because the Anglo-Saxons remained settled there. And we know this from the place name evidence. When you look at a place like Gunthorpe outside Nottingham, that's Gunhild's Thorpe, so that's a farm owned by Gunhild, and that's Old Norse. You also get mixing of the two. Toten is Tofi's tune, and Tofi's an Old Norse name, but tune is an Anglo-Saxon word for a farm. So quite clear that there is mixing of the two populations. It's most likely that the people most affected were those at the top of the social tree, the elites who ruled, and they were the ones who suffered most from the Vikings, while the ordinary everyday people lived alongside them as much as possible.
Due to the peaceful relations between the groups as the Anglo-Saxons regained control of the region, the Viking settlers were left in peace. Half the garrison of Nottingham after it was retaken was actually made up of Norse settlers. The unique Anglo-Scandinavian culture had more meaning to these people than their blood loyalties.
The settlement basically shaped the East Midlands. The East Midlands would not exist in the form they exist now without the Viking settlement.
Even upon arrival, the Vikings came to these lands to settle.